Yes. Good evening. Welcome in the Balie. Also great that you're here on a Saturday night. And also welcome to people who are watching the live stream. My name is Marlijn Geurts. I'm program editor and moderator here in the Balie. And I'm very excited about tonight's main guest, Nino Haratischwili, who is here by the invitation of Nederlands Theaterfestival in the Balie. Just as many of you, I have been really hooked to her most famous book, The Eight Life for Brilka. But I also enjoyed very much The Cat and the General, and this summer I read Het Schaarse Licht with much pleasure. So I'm really happy to talk with her tonight about her authorship, and I think on top of that, that what is happening in Europe, and especially in Georgia, makes it much more important and very important to speak with her at this moment. So I'm really glad that she's with us tonight. First I will speak with Nino alone, and then we have a second important guest who will joining us, Alicia Gescinska. I will introduce her in a bit later. And at the end of the program, there will also be room for questions from your side. So if you have something, please keep it till the end. But first, I give a very warm welcome to novelist, playwright, and theater director Nino Haratischwili.
Good evening. Thank you. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah. That went well. Yeah. Great. Welcome. Great that you are here. You are a couple of days in Amsterdam. Did you had a nice time today in Amsterdam?
Yes. I already had a very nice and interesting talk yesterday. So yeah, it's always a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. And are you writing at the moment as well?
I've
during
started
those days?
this April. Yes, and I'm trying to, but it's always like a little bit challenging because I have some travels, I have some duties, kids, and I have to improvise a lot. But for tomorrow, I already planned to sit some hours and work here in Amsterdam, yes.
Great to hear. We're gonna delve into your authorship, but I thought it's first good to maybe start a bit with what's going on around us at the moment, because this October, end of October, there will be elections in Georgia. And for many people in Georgia, it feels as one of the most important elections since decades, maybe. And they say for them it feels a bit as an all or nothing moment. And I was wondering if you share that feeling.
Absolutely, yes. It's kind of a very, we're all waiting for these elections. We're trying to stay hopeful. It's not so easy, because this spring had been very rough and very challenging, and we've all been demonstrating and protesting.
You were also there doing demonstrations.
I was in Berlin, but in Berlin we had also huge demonstrations, and I was very much involved and had some speeches and talking with press, and so I was very much involved, yes, in all this. Yes, in this very challenging situation, and still trying to stay hopeful. I've returned from Georgia like 2 weeks ago and talked. I had a kind of a little tour there and traveled through the country and meet a lot of readers, a lot of people. We've been talking a lot about politics, of course, and I'm very worried, but trying to tell myself, okay, keep calm and wait and see what happens.
Yeah, and can you maybe explain because in Western media, it's a bit covered, but not that much. So then you see in April there were huge demonstrations against the law that is trying to get foreign elements out of the country. And there was some articles about it in Dutch newspapers. And then we have the elections in October. What's happening at the moment? Are people protesting? Are they a bit silent and being afraid about these elections that are coming up?
We have a party, a Georgian Dream Party. They're like the head of the government. Mm-hmm. The kind of chief of that party is Bidzina Ivanishvili. He is an oligarch. And this party is already there for 12 years. And as they started, they were, officially they've always been very pro-Western and very Western-orientated and like heading towards Europe and so on. But it was always a little bit weird because I never really truly believed in what they were representing. And after the beginning of the war in the Ukraine, it became very visible that they're not so much Western orientated because they were against sanctions, against Russia, and so on. And last spring, they tried to, they start to talk about this so-called anti-foreign agents law. This law is kind of a copy, similar things that they did in Russia many years ago. This is how it started actually in Russia and ended up in what we see now, what is going on there. And officially it's like something that can control all the NGOs and like every company that is mainly financed from abroad. But unofficially it's a mechanism to control. Because for example, it could be also for independent media and press, if they're financed from abroad, the state can control it. So it means it's a step towards censorship, because this is how in Russia they started with a similar law and ended up in closing and throwing out every NGO and like every political center, cultural center, and so on. And that was last spring, and people become very mad. They all went out on the streets, and there have been like big demonstrations and riots. And at some point, the government said, okay, we don't do it anymore. But this spring, like 1 year later, they started it again, came up with that law, and they pushed it through. Behind that law, there were like 2 more laws behind. One, it's the so-called offshore law. It means that, for example, all this criminal money, especially from Russia, can be washed in Georgia. I mean, I'm explaining it in a very non-diplomatic way. Officially, of course, they explain it differently. And then there is one more law, the so-called LGBTQI propaganda law. Also a mechanism of like censorship and controlling, because what does it mean, propaganda? For example, I staged a play about relationship between 2 women. Mm-hmm. This is something that it's in repertoire in a theater in Tbilisi, and they could tell me that it's propaganda, and they could forbid this play, for example. I mean, it all continues. It started 2 years ago. It's a very, very difficult situation also in cultural life. And almost every artist, every writer, every filmmaker is in boycott, and with like state institutions, because it's impossible to work with them. And then the oligarch, who is also very kind of mysterious, and because this is also a very problematic thing, that he is kind of a king. He rules everything. He's the head of that party, but officially he has no position, so he cannot be charged. And he's like a puppet player, or he's like a king. Now he appeared much more than he did before, and started to talk very weird things. Started to, and it became visible that it gets more and more Russian orientated. Yes, and then all that led to this big demonstrations, like 300,000 people outside in streets. And I'm very proud that there were a lot of students, a lot of very young people. Somehow they managed not to end up in violence. Yeah. and we're very proud of it. But now it's calm because, I mean, the protests, they lasted for months, but it didn't change anything, unfortunately. And now we're all hoping for the elections, because the elections are in end of October, and the only way to kind of survive is to re-elect them and that they can just like leave. But nobody knows if they're going to do that or if they're going to manipulate or what's going to happen. And it's a very, very painful situation because, I mean, Georgia is struggling since independence in 91. It's every step, you know, it's like every step towards future, towards West, it ends up with like 2 steps back. And of course, the biggest problem remains Russia and the Russian impact. And we still have this occupation situation, 20% of the country is occupied. And we have this problem with creeping borders. The Russians are pushing the borders like more and more inside the country, and so on and so on. So it's like now we're at this junction between West and North.
Yeah, and with you're explaining a lot and.
Yeah, sorry.
No, it's okay.
It's like I
very
feel like a teacher.
Yeah. But maybe
you
you
like
have studied like
lesson.
so much history, the history of Georgia, for the works that you made. Do you feel that this year or the events that you're describing is a new episode in this history of Georgia, that this is a historical year, and that maybe these elections are gonna be historical elections? Or is that too early to say?
It's kind of historical all the time, unfortunately. Because it never gets boring. And, but yes, now it's, I mean, it's always have been very, very stressful since I remember myself. There have been demonstrations. Georgians love to demonstrate. And it's always such a mess because people are really fed up, they're tired, and they just want to live their life because, I mean, historically, it's maybe nothing, 30 years, but for a human being, it's like almost, yeah, I mean, it's your life, and you only have your one life. And of course, you don't want to spend this life outside in the streets screaming and still hoping and waiting that you get equal rights and that you get, like, values that you really believe in or you want for your kids, and so on and so on. Yes, I mean, it's kind of historical. Yes, it's a really important moment because, yeah, what's going to happen? And because Georgia, we had also some big steps towards Europe in the last 10, 15 years. A lot of good things happened, and especially like cultural life, it was flourishing, and a lot of things, a lot of very good things were going on. And now it seems that, you know, all the efforts and all this work is going to be eliminated by this very silly guys, and we don't want that, and people don't want that, and it's frustrating, of course.
Yeah, yeah. We're gonna speak also with Alicia, if she's joining, about democracy and about what's going on in Europe and your position as writers, but maybe first delve a bit into your work. And I know a lot of people have read the Achtste Lewe, the Eighth Life, but I actually maybe wanted to ask you to read something from your most recent book, Het Schaarse Licht. And maybe, yeah, maybe for the people who didn't read it, it's a story that is happening in the 90s of Georgia with 4 girls. And they are trying to grow up, and they're trying to build a life of each other. And on the background, you have the 90s, where Georgia is, the Soviet Union is falling apart, and a lot is happening. Maybe you can read it. It's in German, and we have Dutch translations, because it's not translated yet in English. So it's a short fragment for people who only speak English, but then we will manage to get you along.
Yeah, it's a day that these 4 friends, they finish school, but it's also a historic day in Georgian history. shortly after becoming independent. Am 26. Mai 1991, dem Tag unserer Abschlussprüfung, wurde Zviad Gamsachurdia der erste frei gewählte Staatspräsident Georgiens. Wir scherten uns nicht darum, wollten viel lieber unsere Freiheit feiern. Und auch wenn diese Freiheit mit der Freiheit unseres Landes einherging, hatte es für uns wenig Bedeutung. An jenem Tag klingelte die Pausenklingel besonders lange. Sie galt uns, nur uns, den Abgängern. Die Lehrer gratulierten uns und kritzelten ihre Namen auf unsere weißen Schürzen und Hemden. Wir stürmten nach der symbolisch abgehaltenen, etwas sentimentalen letzten Unterrichtsstunde, bei der sogar die Störenfriede der Klasse ruhig und nachdenklich waren, in die Flure hinaus, rissen alle Türen auf und kreischten und sangen und feierten uns und alle Verheißungen. Es roch so schmerzlich betörend nach Flieder, wie es im Mai in unserer Stadt üblich ist. Ist diese Stadt noch meine? Kann ich sie noch meine nennen, wo ich doch so viele Fliederblüten verpasst habe? Wann hört etwas auf, das eigene zu sein? Wo liegt die Grenze, an dem das Vertraute zum Fremden wird? Kann uns die eigene Kindheit jemals fremd werden? Wir sammelten uns auf dem Schulhof, die Jungs tranken Wein aus Limonadenflaschen, manche Mädchen hatten sich ihnen bereits angeschlossen. Sogar Ida, die die letzten Wochen wie eine Nonne verbracht hatte, war erneut zum Leben erwacht und strahlte. Wir spurteten auf die Straße, genossen die bewundernden Blicke der jungen Schüler, die uns mit einer Mischung aus Neid und Sehnsucht verfolgten. Wir wollten jeden Augenblick dieses besonderen Tags für uns haben, ihn trinken wie ein Heiltrank. Alles schien möglich an diesem Tag, als könnten wir alle Wege gehen. Wir hielten uns an der Hand und überquerten das kahle Feld, auf dem einst der Unterricht in physische Kultur stattgefunden hatte. Später taumelten wir freudetrunken die Engelstraße hinunter, gröhlend. Alle sollten uns sehen und hören, denn endlich waren wir die Herrscher über unser eigenes Schicksal. Endlich waren wir die Könige in unserem eigenen Reich. Wie naiv wir doch waren. Danke. Thank you.
In this book, you are actually describing also the time that you grew up in Georgia. And I was wondering, like, this position of those girls, that at the background there's a lot happening, really political, but actually they're also just enjoying their life, trying to get friendships, falling in love. Is that something that, if you look back upon your childhood, that you were doing that as well?
Of course. Yes. I mean, I'm a bit younger than these four girls, so when this very dark period started in Georgia, I started to go to school. It was 89, yes. It was the first phase of the attempts of becoming independent, and with a lot of uprisings and violence and Russian tanks. And then 91, the country became independent, but we had a lot of civil wars and economical crisis and very dark, very violent period. And it lasted more than 10 years, roundabout. And of course, I grew up during that period, and I've seen that all. It surrounded everybody. It was impossible not to be surrounded by that. And but of course, I became aware of all that kind of later, when I was already a teenager, and then later when I moved to Germany, realizing how different my childhood and my youth was from my German friends, for example. So I start to think and analyze all that much later, because during that time as a kid and even as a teenager, you know, you have only this life and you have nothing else to compare. And somehow I'm also very lucky that I was so young and I was not in charge of somebody else or having kids on my own, because I still felt kind of protected by my parents or grandparents. I went to school, I had friends, I did a lot of bullshit that you do when you're a teenager. And for me it was kind of normal. But of course, when I later came to Germany and started to live in Western Europe, I realized, okay, it was not so normal and it was quite traumatizing. But still, also, I cannot say that it was only terrible, because it made us somehow also very resilient, you know. When I look at my mother now, I don't know what can happen that kind of shakes her. Mm-hmm. She's always like, yeah, we survived that, so we will survive this as well. And I mean, I don't romanticize or I don't miss this period, but I'm also thankful that for me as a writer, of course, it's also a gift. And yes, but many people did not survive this time, so it's also very, I cannot say that it was it ended good for everybody.
Yeah, but you said in many interviews that you had to write first the 8th Life to tell the history of het schaarse licht. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, when you grew up, was the history of national history of Georgia, was that something that your parents or your mother was telling you, that she said this is what happened before you were born? Is that something that people told from the one to the other?
Of course, in every family, we had tons of stories about grand and grandparents, mm-hmm. and some stories from the war, like the Second World War. And my grandmother, she was an intellectual, and she had a lot of friends whose parents were sent to gulags or disappeared. So I kind of heard a lot of stories about the purge and Stalin's terror and so on. But it was not this way, because a lot of people imagine that, I don't know why, but maybe because it's also a exotic image of Georgia, that my grandmother was sitting with me in front of a chimney and telling a lot of stories about past. Of course, it was not this way. It was not that I was hearing or listening to kind of fairy tales from the past. I knew some things, but I was missing a lot. It was like a puzzle where I only had parts and I could not get the whole picture. And at school, of course, they've been teaching history, but this history during that time I grew up, it was happening.
Yeah.
It was not something that was gone. We still were dealing with all that. It was present, it was there, all the problems, all the challenges, all this violence, all this, I don't know. So that's why what happened in Stalin period, nobody could afford to care about, because sometimes
because it was, in a sense, not over yet. It was still happening.
Yeah, it was not over.
Yeah.
That's why I become more, how to say, maybe humble or kind of patient, because I was always mad and angry, and I always asked this question, why would never make this kind of analyze, like, for example, Germans were forced to do after the Second World War. But after doing the research and writing this book, I understood that sometimes it's also a luxury to be able to do so. Because when you're surviving and you're still surviving and in the middle of surviving, you cannot afford to think what happened and so on. For me as a writer, of course, I have this luxury. I can step out, I have the distance, I can sit down, I can dig in history, I can do research, I can travel and so on, but it's a privilege. And not everybody can do who is trying to survive, I mean, literally.
Yeah.
So now I'm kind of a little bit more... I understand it better why it could not happen. And even now, what we've been talking some minutes ago, it also is kind of history that is continuing. And we still have this, it's still the same problem that, okay, we're trying to be independent, we try to be the creators of our own destiny, but it's not possible. Still, we have to deal with our neighbor, and our neighbor is never, he's never satisfied, and it continues, and we have the, people who are selling their I say a little bit pathetic, their souls for money and doing what they're doing now. So it all continues. It's all the same. It's a circle. It's never ending, and it's really, really exhausting. Yes.
Yeah, and this maybe exhausting is the good word in the sense that if you reading this task that you had to write it's of course not the history of Georgia, but it's a lot of history about Georgia in your work. Did you ever hesitate to go that deep into this history? Because it's, for me, it seems a really heavy task, a big responsibility that you took.
Yes, in this case, I kind of ended up there without knowing what I was doing, and maybe that was better this way, because I wasn't planning that to become kind of a scientist and do this kind of research. I wanted to write a story about a Georgian family. I knew that it would last a while, and I knew that I had to dig and so on, but I never imagined that it would take me 4 years, and it would take me to all the places and to the archives, and I would travel so much, and I would like live only with this and doing
4 years
that.
is really short, I think.
Yeah, the last 2 years, I didn't have any social life. I never met friends. I was never at home. I was always somewhere, mostly in Russia. At that time, it was kind of accessible for people like me. Yes, so I kind of jumped into, and I always compare it with a building with a lot of doors, and every time when I thought I entered every door and I've been in every room, I discovered one more and one more. There have been situations, I remember one situation, I discovered a document about like female, I was researching about if there had been some special female kind of tortures in NKVD, the former KGB, kind of like, you know, in concentration camps and Nazis, and I was trying to find some similarities. Is there like kind of a male torturing and female torturing? And I ended up some documents that really I become sick. I mean, physically, I was sitting there and I thought, okay. Now I feel that I need fresh air. I have to go out because I'm really. It makes me sick because it's something so unimaginable that people are able to do this kind of things that you cannot even invent. I mean, I cannot invent anything. My fantasy, even like my darkest one, cannot invent anything that it had not already happened or had been kind of realized by people. And that was a shock, and I remember that I was really paralyzed somehow. But it was very much in the middle, so I knew that I would continue. And at some point, even with all this darkness, but on the next day, I often found some situations or met people with so much kindness and humanity, and they were so helping, and so they shared so many great stories with me. And you always had these two things. And it was like one day, oh, terrible, terrible, unbearable. And next day it was, okay, I have to continue. And somehow, when you're so much into something, then you become also a little bit obsessed. I mean, I do. And then there is like no point of turning back. And then you just continue without asking yourself where you're going to end up.
Yeah, yeah. And maybe to... this writing process, like in my head, because the framework of the novel and the way it is constructed is really impressive and really beautiful. And in my head, I was imagining, like, how did you manage to write it? Did you have a really big board with all different characters?
I never have.
No?
No. I had a really tiny notebook.
And how many extra pages? Like, I was also wondering if you said, like, it's a flat with many doors, and then you discover a new one, a new one, a new one. How many extra pages did you have? Or did you had to delete a lot, or was it Are you a person who writes from the beginning to the end?
I think that we cut it out approximately 200 pages in the end. Yeah. But not like on, I mean, parts from that, parts from that. So in the end, it's like summed up. I do not work with the sideboards and with these plans. And in this case, it was kind of even easier. You know why? Because when you spend so much time with characters and so much time with your issues, and you're really into that, and this was really, I mean, now I always like stop and continue because of several other things. In this case, it was the same, but back then I had the luxury that I was doing only that, the last 2 years. And the good thing is that then you really do leave that, and you don't have to check or double check, or you think that
you're middle in it.
Yeah, they're like your family, and you really have a feeling that they're real, and you know everything about them, and you know how they look and how they talk and how they move. So somehow it felt really, I just continue and continue. So. Okay, sometimes I had to go back to some pages and make some corrections, but mostly I try not to, when I start writing, just to go on and not even read what I have written till I finish. And sometimes it's bad because when I write like for work for 4 years, of course I forgot what I have written like 2 years ago. And sometimes I repeat myself. That's why we have to cut out so much stuff. But it helps me because I'm trying not to be judgmental about myself, about the characters, and I know that I will be as soon as I start reading. So it kind of helps a lot. Because I don't like this editing. I have to do it anyway, in the end. I have to do it on my own, I have to do it with the editor, so I already know that it will happen. So I want to cherish this writing process fully, and I will not if I start to judge myself.
In the fragment that you just read, there's like the person's character is asking herself like, about her city where she was born. When does something stop to belong to you? And as long at the moment that you're gone from it, when something becomes familiar, when becomes it foreign or something to you? And I was wondering how that is for you, your relationship with Georgia. How?
I'm very often there. I have an apartment there, so it's like a home, of course, still is. The language is very important. Big part of my family, they do live in Tbilisi, and friends and so on. I also work from time to time in Tbilisi, for example, in theaters. And it feels quite familiar still. But of course, my point of view has changed, and I always have like this perspective from distance. But this is the same for Germany, actually. I mean, I'm always like somewhere in between, and sometimes it's annoying and exhausting, and sometimes it can be also a privilege and a gift because you have a possibility to see some things what you cannot see when you like look from the middle. It's only possible when you look from outside. So I think it's both. But sometimes when I'm there, like this summer, I always ask myself this question, could I stay here? I mean, how would it feel to know that I'm not returning to Berlin, for example? And then I realized that it would be very difficult for me. That this...
Why?
I don't know, because I got used to it. Like half of my life, I lived this kind of life between these two countries. And in the beginning, I suffered a lot. And now it feels very natural to me. And the other way would feel a little bit artificial, I guess. Got used to it.
And also maybe the writing, that the position in between helped you to write, if I understood correctly, a bit.
Do you mean German or do you mean
No, you said like
generally?
that the fact that I have a certain distance helped me maybe in writing down what I wanted to write.
Of course, yes. Yeah. For writing, it's very important. I can only write with distance. I could never write about anything that like happened right now. And I go home and then I sit down and write. It would feel like a diary, and this is not kind of my approach to literature. I'm not interested in like analyzing myself all the time and writing all the time about myself. I'm more interested in becoming someone else. This is actually what I like about writing, not being Nino, because I'm Nino all the time, but being somebody else and having so many different lives. And yeah, that's why this distance is very, very important to me. And it helps, of course, this distance, geographical distance, distance in time, but also distance in language.
Yeah, yeah. And you're sometimes called German author, sometimes Georgian author, sometimes both.
Oh, yeah.
I was, you told a lot, like you spoke with a lot of love about the culture of Georgia. And I was wondering, how do you feel that you, as a writer, are building upon Georgian literature that's already written, or?
Not so much, no. I think I'm more like a world literature, because I was not so, my grandmother, she was the one who introduced me or brought me into this world of literature. She was a scientist, but she was a great reader, and she got a lot of books, but mostly because she was like the 30th generation, and everyone who was academic back then was forced to speak Russian. Otherwise, you could not do your PhD, and you could not have your career in science unless you spoke Russian. So she mostly spoke Russian, and her books were in Russian. It means that I started to read Russian literature first, and then like European, and then American, and only like at school and much later I started to read the Georgian classics, because most books we had were in Russian. And that's why I'm not so much influenced by like the Georgian classics as I am influenced by Russian ones or German ones or French ones.
And is it now in Georgia maybe similar to Ukraine, that they are now also really celebrating their national literature and celebrating national culture, that you see that now maybe more Georgian writers are being reread in Georgia? Or that it's more going to the center, the front?
Of course, now it's very, very difficult, also the relationship with Russian culture and language, unfortunately. Even I kind of discovered this summer that I have some troubles with talking Russian, because I speak Russian. For me, it was very familiar to speak Russian. As I mentioned, I read tons of books in Russian. But for example, this summer, we have a lot of Russian tourists, and when they ask you what time is it or how they can go from A to B, they immediately start to talk in Russian and don't ask if you do speak Russian. And the younger generation, for example, they don't speak Russian anymore. They don't want to learn it. And that makes me mad. And I realized that at some point a woman, she was like asking how to go to the street, and she just start to talk in Russian without asking, and I automatically answered, and this is such a colonialistic approach actually, and I kind of got in conflict with myself, and it happens like every second day. And I think that, of course, it becomes very, very difficult to separate, because years ago, I was always like, no, we have to separate the language and culture and politics and so on. But when it comes so much, I mean, when it happens in your everyday life and you're surrounded by that all the time, or for example, I wanted to buy a cappuccino and I entered a cafe, and this cafe is run by Russians, and they were only talking Russian. And I was like, And while buying this cappuccino, I already got in such a geopolitical conflict with myself and thinking about the history and like beginning from the 19th century that afterwards I could not even drink this cappuccino, you know? This is what I mean. So it all becomes so political and so difficult to say, no, it's like separated and culture has nothing to do. It has to do. Unfortunately, it has to do. And in this case, unfortunately. And I do not believe that art in general can be somehow not political as life. And especially in Georgia, where politics, it's nothing that you just like watch in the news or read in newspapers. It sleeps with you in the bed, it sits with you at your breakfast, and it happens all the time, it surrounds you. So you don't have any choice. And literature, back to literature, yes, I mean, a lot of things happened. What I really like is that 2018, Georgia was a guest of honor in Frankfurt, and Frankfurt Book Fair, and a lot of books been translated in German, I hope in Dutch as well, in French. So a lot of things begun to develop and were Georgian film is very, very much, there are a lot of great young, there's a young generation of Georgian filmmakers, very interesting ones. And a lot of things were going on, musicians anyway. So people were become interested and become aware that there is this country, Georgia, and no, we're not Russians, and that we exist. And art and culture is and was, of course, very helpful for that. And of course, it's very important that we get the chance, or Georgia gets the chance to tell his or her own story besides the Russian one and besides like this imperialistic narrative.
Yeah. I think you touched upon a topic that we would also like to discuss with our second guest, because when I invited her, she said like, oh, finally I can speak with another writer who is also not afraid to say I'm a political writer and all culture is political. Our second speaker is Alicia Gescinska. She's a writer, philosopher, and important public speaker in Belgium. She was born in Poland, but now she lives and works in Belgium. She wrote many philosophical books, but also theater and theater plays and novels. Welcome. Give her a warm welcome. Great that you are joining us as well. How did you listen so far to the conversation?
It's wonderful to listen to both of you, and of course, very inspiring to hearing Nino's story. And I think it's great that through your stories, through your books, you shed light on a part of Europe, of part of our history as well. I think European history that many do not know. So, yeah.
And in preparation for this evening, you read The Eighth Life.
It was a gift, don't worry.
Thank you.
What was your reading experience, maybe?
Well, first, to be honest, when you get this brick on your table, you think, oh no. But then once you start, it really flows. You have a wonderful pen, and the way you write, you're just in the story, you feel the characters, you sympathize with them, you're angry with them, they become like part of your family. So I think it's a brilliant job you have done.
And by reading her work, was there something that, like now you're sitting next to her, you're really curious about, or something that you wanted to know after reading it?
Well, I think you already asked that in a way, but I was wondering if when you started this book, if you really wanted to, I think there is a big difference between people from the East and the West, like I'm talking very generalizing terms now, but a lot of people in Germany, in Belgium, in Flanders, in Holland, France, they do not know certain things. We have a different background in the sense that, as you said, we know the stories of our grandparents and parents, of the gulags, of being afraid to speak, of how times changed, that the political umbrella we lived under, that freedoms were not guaranteed. And I wondered if you have written it to open the eyes also from the West, to show them that people so close to home have a completely different past and experience with our continent, and that a lot of things that here people take for granted, a lot of freedoms, are not so easy in other countries very nearby.
It was kind of I mean, yes, I was aware that I was writing this book in German and it would be somehow published in German. Of course, I didn't know if somebody would read it or not, but I was trying to keep it on mind that I should maybe explain things a little bit more than I would do it in Georgian, for example. So I guess so. But first of all, I started really in a very selfish way. It was a very selfish mission because I really wanted to understand myself. As I mentioned, it was like a puzzle. I knew some stories, but some didn't. And I was always like, I had a lot of questions about my past. And I'm always repeating the sentence, but I really remember one day I realized, I was living in Germany for 7 or 8 years, I realized that, I don't know, I was reading a book and it was a good book and it was about history and about Nazis, and while I was reading I thought, yes, but I do know that, I already read it somewhere and we all do know that. And then I realized, yes, I do know that, but do I know the same like from the other side? What was going on during that period in Soviet Union, in Georgia, in Russia, in all the other countries? And I realized that almost everything I do know about the history of the 20th century, I do know from the Western perspective. Even I was born and grew up in Georgia. And while I realized that, I thought, okay, I have to change it. I want to understand it. And this is actually, that was the need, this really urgent need in me, why I kind of started. And then afterwards, of course, at some point, I start to realize, okay, this is something that German readers or Western readers will not know, so maybe I should explain a little bit. So excuse me that it became so, because I had to explain a little bit more, but I don't know. But first of all, yes, it was because I felt that I should understand things kind of better for myself.
Yeah. Is it something that you feel that you need to do the whole time? Like explain what's happening from in Eastern or Central part of Europe to a Western audience?
Well, I realize that I have a different outlook. So when I look to the news or when I read books, that I interpret them or read them in slightly different ways than my colleagues. For example, when Putin was preparing for the war, a week before the big invasion, I was at the studio in television, and we were talking about that, and everyone was, no, it will never happen, and we don't know what Putin wants. And I was like, yes, we do know what he wants, and he will enter the country. It's just a matter of days, maybe weeks, I don't know. And everyone was like, no, he will not do that. And I was thinking, oh, they are so naive, of course he will do that. And it's like little things like that that always annoy me, that there is another feeling of threat, another feeling of urgency. And I think another difference is that a lot of freedoms we have, I think Belgians and in the Netherlands, many people take them for granted. We have them and we will always have them. We have democracy, we will always have democracy. And I always feel that it's more precarious, that things, we have them now, but that does not mean we will have them tomorrow. We will have to be very vigilant and care for them, and we have to use our voice and speak up and defend them if necessary. And I'm not afraid of defending them, especially not in a country where there are no gulag camps, like Belgium and in the Netherlands. So this is one of the differences that I feel. And there are many like those differences. When you speak about politics, which I very often do, or write about politics, the general feeling and conversation I have is that people want to be free from politics in Belgium and the Netherlands. When we are free from politics, we are free. And while in Poland, for example, it's you're free through politics. You have to have this umbrella of politics that guarantees you those freedoms, and that's why you have to be interested in politics. It's not just an umbrella that appears, you know, it's one that we are responsible for. And all those little things. And I do feel, maybe responsible in a way. Maybe I feel the need to defend certain things or explain certain things. But then I feel also that it brings those two parts together, because I don't want to make the divide between East and West bigger than it is. I feel one of the things that I very often do, and that's why I also so much appreciate your work, is that it shows how the East and the West always were in dialogue with each other and are still in dialogue with each other. And there is sometimes this arrogancy, like, oh, for example, with Georgia, it's probably Russia or it's far away. And no, we are part of a bigger dialogue. We were thinking together, creating together. We have a shared culture. There are differences, of course, but we do, in one way or another, but in the most important way, belong to each other and have to support each other.
And maybe to both of you, first of you, like before the full-scale invasion, you wrote an opinion piece in a Dutch newspaper about like the West being on holiday and not seeing the urgency of what is happening. And you're speaking about like this distance between East and West, and that the divide is maybe smaller than we think. But do you feel that the Western perspective since the full-scale invasion has become closer, or that they really see the urgency of what's happening? Okay. Both of you, I want to hear.
It changed, of course, it changed. I mean, unfortunately, due to a war.
Yeah.
And everything what's going on in the Ukraine right now is going on since, 20 years elsewhere.
Yeah.
And I mean, the last Crimea, for example, 2014, it's also Ukraine, but it was still far away from the Western point of view. So we had Abkhazia, we had Ossetia, we had two wars in Chechnya, we had Syria and so on, and we had Crimea, but it was all kind of far away. And I think, for example, in Germany, that the shock was due to seeing the tanks rolling towards Kiev and realizing, okay, here's Germany, then comes Poland, and after Poland there is Kiev, so it means they're coming close. So this is what happened. And unfortunately, it has, because it was, everybody knew that Russia was not, as Schröder said, great place for, great example of democracy, but it was better and somehow more cozy and somehow easier to think that, they have to deal with their own problems. And I mean, Georgia was their own problem, Chechnya was their own problem, everything, even Crimea was their own problem because it was far away. At some point, because I also had so much anger in me when I was realizing that even friends of mine know it will never happen. And I was like, it's happening already. It is happening, you don't see it because you, get Russian gas and it's better to whatever. So, of course, it's sad, but I think the awareness is there, more and more, and people are more and more interested. There is this huge gap between East and West still. I really agree that there always been this dialogue, but sometimes I have a feeling that we don't speak the same languages. And in Germany, I got so mad because after maybe like 2, 3, 4 weeks after the war, after the invasion, there have been some German intellectuals, they decided, they had an article with hundreds of artists and intellectuals and people from cultural life who signed that, and they were trying to call for peace. Okay, it's good, and they were like trying to convince German government not to send any weapons, and send kind of milk powder. And I remember myself when back in 90s, we also got tons of milk powder from United States. And I got really so mad because, of course, it's great to talk about freedom and to be a pacifist when you're sitting on your designer sofa, drinking your 20-euro red wine and talking about all that. Then it's kind of sexier to be for milk powder and not for Kalashnikovs. But when somebody's standing in front of you with a Kalashnikov against you, you don't want to have milk powder. And this is the reality, and this is what I mean when I get mad with some friends of mine when they're starting these conversations, because really, of course, I don't want weapons.
Yeah.
And of course, I want a world full of flowers and milk powder. But Russia is not this kind of world. And he doesn't really care, Putin doesn't care about milk powder. So this is what always have been this problem between that it's kind of political incorrect to be for weapons, but it means that people are dying for that because you don't want to be political incorrect. And this is what we have to become sometimes aware of. And this is the gap. And sometimes, yes, of course, I cannot imagine, I cannot believe that I was standing there 2 years ago and I was like screaming for Kalashnikovs. Of course I have this conflict inside of me. Of course, everybody in 21st century, that we're still there, that we're still talking about Kalashnikovs and weapons. But if somebody is, yes, as I mentioned, if somebody puts a gun against you, then you cannot afford to be a pacifist. And yeah, it's a huge topic.
Alicia?
Well, Nino, it was very consoling a moment for me to hear you talk, because I had such a moment myself that I was trying to explain in the newspaper why I think that weapons are necessary and that we need to invest in military, while I'm a pacifist. So I'm just like, and no, in theory, I'm a pacifist. But if you look to the reality, and so I so much understand this conflict, inner conflict that you have, and it's just very difficult to turn away from the reality. And if you want to face it, you have to face what is happening. And what is happening is now, at this moment, children are put on train and brought to Russia. Ukrainian children are on trains going to Russia, being Russified. People are brought away and being Russified. Belarusian people cannot speak their language. Young people are put in camps to become better Belarusians, which means Russians, for Putin and Lukashenko, and so on. And then Georgia, so many people want also belong to the free, westernized side of Europe, and are condemned almost and pushed to live maybe in fear, maybe without freedom. And we have to ask ourselves: will we turn away, and will we just sit on our sofas and drink our coffees and say that we want, freedom worldwide, and that we want peace? Or will we actually open our eyes and face what is happening on the ground and stand with the people that need us?
Yeah. This program is called Writing in Times of War, and I had a discussion with somebody who said, like, yeah, but is that the right title? Because is there a war going on in Georgia? Maybe not. And I was wondering...
It kind of is, because,
yeah,
it is.
Maybe my question is because...
We have Russian soldiers on our ground. Mm-hmm. There are parts of Georgia I cannot enter as Georgian. And now we have even this ideological war, because if they're going to win, then I know, okay, there is this danger to return back to Father Russia.
Yeah, and I think it's an excellent title, and a war does not start with bombs or Kalashnikovs. It starts way sooner than that, as you said, with the language, with Russification, with what language you can speak. They try to control what you think, and if they control what you think, then already they start
and
a
this
war.
propaganda is also, it's going on for years, and we have the same in Georgia. There's tons of this Russian propaganda, and the very pervert things that our government now do is, and that is so unforgivable, they have this narrative that they started to manipulate with. Do you want war? This is like what they, because yes, I understand you want towards Europe and you want but see what Europe does? Nothing. See what happens to Ukraine. So if we go towards Europe and Russia will enter, nobody is going to help you. And people who recall, and the last war between Russia and Georgia was 2008, so it's not history, it was yesterday, they all are traumatized by war. It means they got, so it's very, yeah, this kind of war, this propaganda war is much terrible at some point, yes.
Yeah. And I was wondering, maybe for you, Alicia, when you are speaking about all these things and what's happening at the moment and the need to explain it in the right way, how do you try to incorporate that, or how position yourself as a writer in this?
Well, I think for every writer, it's a personal thing. I don't want to say that every writer should do this or that, or every journalist should do this. This is how, yes, I feel, and I feel that I have to use the space that I have in the newspaper or the books that I write. Well, they are a reflection of the reflection that goes inside of me, and the struggles that go inside of me. They are not about me necessarily, but the problems, I try to face the problems I see and try to discuss them. And I do feel almost, and I will say a word that people dislike in the West, a moral responsibility towards my fellow human beings and to write in a certain way. And I feel that, or better, very often when I have conversations about that, people, or how to say, they think that writing should be free from politics. And of course, I don't want to write I'm not writing ideologically. I think that ideology pollutes thinking, and literature is doing the opposite very often. But I do think that we have to dare to ask questions, try to answer those questions in the public arena, in the public space. And I think I'm very much on the same page as Martha Gellhorn, a war journalist, and she said that if people say I'm not interested in politics, then you can just say I'm not interested in the water I drink, in the air I breathe, in the people around me, in the way we live, and if we die or not, and the way we die or live. And if you do care about your fellow human being, and if you do care about yourself and your life and the freedoms we have, well, then you should be interested in politics and be interested in what is going on. And I'm talking about this bigger umbrella. And we have to always, as I said, be vigilant, and therefore, if we see something is going wrong in our society as well, because our society is not, it's also fragile. Putin's propaganda is not ending at the borders of Germany, for example. It enters even the parliament of the Netherlands. You have politicians that are fans of Putin. and they tell his theories and his lies. So we always have to try to see what is unfolding in front of our eyes and try to have a conversation about that. And that can be through literature, that can be through evenings like that, it can be in an op-ed. But the worst thing you can do is be silent. I think that's a very clear choice you make.
You're nodding, you recognize her position, what she's just saying?
Agree, totally.
Yeah. Maybe a question in the writing, like sometimes in your books it's a struggle between the repetition of history and the fact that you cannot almost escape history and the longing for freedom or a different life in a way. And I was thinking, like, you're writing such dark passages of history and that it almost seems not possible to create this freedom or to create this democracy. Can it also stand in the way for the fight for democracy in Georgia? Telling all those really dark parts of history. That you become almost too pessimistic, maybe. That's my question.
I'm always trying to put some hope between the lines, and even this book, it ends with an empty page, and it ends with a new generation who is still, who wants to change things and who is really willing to change things and who is willing to live her own life and so on. So I'm always trying to stay somehow hopeful, and it's not that I kind of choose some very dark spots for like scandals or being more interesting. As I mentioned, there is nothing that I can invent that is not already have been invented. And this is kind of, okay, this is my way to describe, and maybe it's more dramatic or it's more dark, but I kind of often cope with real facts and real history. Still, okay, the characters are fictional, but everything what's like going on behind, it's inspired by reality. And yes, I totally agree that I always, as a citizen, as a human being, as a writer, I would always choose to face things than to close my eyes, even if it's painful or even if it's kind of unpleasant, because I know that this ghosts will come back at some point. When you do this and that, and maybe you just like turn around and they will appear in some very unexpected places. So I think it's better to know, it's better to face, it's better to see and try to find ways out. And it doesn't mean that even during the war, I remember these days in 2008, I was there when the war started in Georgia, during the openings of Olympics in China. It was August, and even through these days, it was completely shock. I was on a vacation, and everybody was like in some places in countryside or at the sea, and nobody was expecting war, but it started. And I remember that even during this period, during these weeks, before I didn't even know if I could go back to Germany or what would happen, we laughed a lot, and we were drinking a lot, and we were hoping, and we were helping each other, and we were doing stuff. And this even everyday life, kind of everyday life, of course, in a completely extreme way, was continuing. And people do need hope. I met a lot of Ukrainian colleagues of mine. They're telling the same, that one of him, Ostap Slivinsky, he teaches, and they have sometimes, he holds his lectures in this bombing shelters. And there is this kind of abnormal normality that continues, and for this to be able to continue something, of course, you need hope, and you need to be kind of I remember that we developed a kind of a very dark humor during these days because you have to laugh. It's also kind of a therapy, you know, otherwise you'll go mad. And that's why it's important to stay hopeful and to still seek like for ways out, even when the world goes mad, maybe especially during that times.
In an article, Alicia, you said like a democracy can only be called dead if she no longer lives in the heart and minds of the people of this country. And I was wondering, like with this line in mind, if you look at Georgia, how do you look upon that?
Well, yes. So democracy, it's when you ask students or people what is democracy, then they will give you like free elections and institutions and this and that, and that's all true. But one thing that is always forgotten in the lists that people name, even in academia, is what people have in their hearts and in their minds when it comes to democracy. And if people believe in democracy, that's a very strong, not a feeling, but a force that can be a big change. That's why I always say you should not bury a democracy before it has died. You have to be vigilant, you have to be careful that you don't take it for granted. But also, as long as people believe in it and as long as people believe in all the values that it upholds and they will defend them, then democracy have a chance to be part of a political system. And when we take a look to Georgia, well, it's difficult because you have this Russian big brother that is very good in crushing not only democracies or hopes, but also what people think and know. Once you can take that over, you can take a lot. And I have written, I think in May, after the protests in April, I have written an article where I said that a little bit naughty title was "Georgia is burning and we don't care." It was in an analogy of an article a couple of years ago written by Alain de Botton, who said Ukraine is burning and we don't care, to show that what is happening there on the ground, we don't listen to the voices that want to belong to Europe, that have this democratic heart. We just think, a lot of Western people think like, but wait a second, do they want freedom? Oh, that's nice, but they are Russian. And they also need our support. When Putin said, people will not care about you, he might be right if he says that to Georgian people, which is very sad, because that should not be the case. We should be caring about them. So a country cannot give a position on its own. It needs the surrounding. It needs us as well. So if we want Georgia to succeed as a democratic country, it's also our responsibility. We should not look at them from far away and see like, what is happening there? Oh, they failed. No, we should be part of helping them to be part of the European family in all ways and forms.
Yeah, the problem is that I was meeting a lot of politicians all the time and giving interviews and so on, explaining throughout the spring. And I agree, but this is so complicated because one politician, German one, he's very supportive, Michael Roth, and he was several times in Georgia and so on, and he was like really, and he even said in an article, in an interview that not Brussels should be the capital of the European Union, but Tbilisi for now, because he's seen all these demonstrations and this spirit and how much engaged everyone was and so on. But I asked him, because Georgians were all like trying to get some sanctions for this 83 politicians who signed the law, this foreign law, agent law. And everybody was asking, because United States then made some, because they are all, for controlling this foreign money, but almost every kid and child, and they're studying abroad. They're not in Russia and in Rostov or in Moscow. They're all in Amsterdam, Paris, Berlin, and so on. And Georgians were all, okay, if you don't like European Union, send their kids back, and please don't give them that they cannot enter these countries. And so this is what we've been asking all the time. And he explained to me, yes, but you know what? We cannot do anything because it's all bureaucracy. Germany on his own cannot make this decision because it's European Union. So it means that even Orban must sign this. And of course he will not. So it means this is it's so much bureaucracy, and people sometimes need this kind of support. That would be like for 83 people, like something, that they cannot enter these countries, that their kids who are all at some universities here go back, and so on, that they feel it, that feel on their own skin. What does it mean to be pro-Russian and against all that values? But it's difficult, yes.
You just said, I'm meeting now with a lot of politicians and people ask me questions. Are you sometimes really exhausted by that? That you need to be this political person who explaining the politics of Georgia?
It's like drinking energy drinks all the time, you know. Every time when I think, okay, it's done, this issue and topic, and I just can talk about literatures, and next catastrophe happens, and then I'm like, oh, I had like 3 Red Bulls, and I start to talk like crazy about the next thing, because it was when this book came out, the invasion started, the war started in the Ukraine, and I was on tour throughout Germany, and I was not talking about that book. I've been explaining Russia, Georgia, the Ukraine, and all the time, and it was this, how could it happen? How could we oversee that, and so on, and I was explaining. And then at some point I said, okay, I cannot do it anymore. I feel not really... because it felt wrong that I was explaining for the Ukrainians. I was sitting there in my safety in Berlin while people were being bombed, and I thought, okay, I will not do that again. And then now, the next interesting stories. So now we have this next challenges in Georgia. And so this spring, I already got my energy drinks. And since then, I'm talking. Of course, sometimes it is exhausting, but what's the alternative? To be silent, it's not an alternative. So I continue and try to do whatever I can, and sometimes I feel very frustrated, and I think it doesn't, what does it bring? But at some point next day, I force myself to believe that it does bring, and I have to be engaged, and I stay engaged, and it's impossible. It's impossible. In my case, it's impossible not to be into that. And I totally agree that in maybe this is because of our history, we do know what it means if you're just like free from politics and you go just like step back, what can happen? And at some point, for example, when Georgians did that, we had Soviet Union for 70 years. So, and now everybody is kind of, okay, we are not allowed to fall asleep. No, we stay awake. We drink tons of energy drinks. And it's kind of it's not a choice, actually.
You recognize it?
Yes, definitely. I think very often it's the feeling I have that it's not a choice. Just have to explain. And actually, to be honest, a lot of people are very grateful. For example, 2 years ago now, I think, I contributed to a translation of a Gulag camp memoir of a Polish philosopher who was there 11 years, Barbara Skarga, and actually a lot of Belgians and people from the Netherlands who got hold of the book and read the book, they really wrote me and said, thank you that it's available, thank you that we can know this part of history we didn't know. And I always replied, it's not, just remember, it's not the past. They still exist, they just not call them Gulag camps. And a lot of people are happy that there is this blind spot that they can remove and that they slowly get to know a little bit more, and that's why I think it's so great that your book is such a success, because I do think that because you tell a lot of the history of the past, it's an introduction for a lot of people, I think, with this part of the world, of Europe, of history. They know something was going on. But even, I'm not that old, I'm not so young anymore, but not that old, but my professors at university, a couple of them were still very proud that they were Trotskyist and Marxist and all of that. And I was like, what are they saying? I mean, I was embarrassed in their place. So I think the West is grateful very often when they open their eyes on what was going on and what is still going on.
Yes, but this is such a very interesting issue. I'm really, really wondering all the time, and so happy that you mentioned, because I often got shocked, even in Germany, and I mean they had GDR for 40 years. They know that part of history, they should know. But even when I have a lot of this very leftish friends, and when they start to idealize the socialism and this Marxism and so on, I'm really shocked, because it's like nobody in Germany or in Europe would say, yes, Hitler was bad, but Nazis, they did a lot of good things, right?
Yeah.
It's the same. People are kind of, I understand that the Marx is not, he's not fault, but this system failed, and the system had as many victims, even more victims than the Nazis.
Yeah.
And how it comes that even still, people, and very, very left-wing people, idealize that and think that it is, no, yes, Stalin, it was a little bit bad, and Mao, and yes, okay.
But
okay,
now,
in Cuba it
will
work
succeed.
As well. Yeah.
But our communist system will succeed.
But it's not, it's the ideology still, it's very good. But I understand that in their imagination, it's so naive to imagine that, it's all about equality and everyone's like about brothers and sisters, but this ideology will never work because it's not the human nature.
Yeah.
And it was not only a failure of like Stalin, there were 16 countries and China and Cuba and so on and so on. And this is something that really, really makes me speechless. I would really like to talk about more, because I'm so often that even some friends of mine, and I really just, I don't know what to say. I'm saying, yeah, it's great, socialism, go for it.
Alicia, can you help her maybe a bit?
No, she's right, of course. There are still people in the West that are very convinced that communist is the solution, and that this is the right ideology, that in the past, of course, it failed because this and this went wrong, but this time it will work because now we have learned. And then it's like, I do understand.
Where do you start to answer?
Well, most of the time I ask if they read Marx, and then if they would do me a favor in reading Leszek Kołakowski, who has debunked everything. Not only it's a Polish philosopher who was, as a young philosopher and political thinker, he belonged to the Marxist party and the Communist party, and then he opened his eyes, and he has written a book, 3-part volume on Marxism, and he shows that it did not fail here and there because of a system or a bad politician or whatever, because it's wrong in how it's constructed. It's just the philosophy is flawed. So then I try to say, well, read that, and then we will continue the conversation. And the conversation never continues. So.
Maybe bring that. I go look at the audience because maybe our people who want to step in have a question as well for one of the two others on stage. I will get the microphone. Oh, yeah.
Yes, but this is fiction. I'm really often confronted with that. Oh, wow.
Thank you very much for the wonderful conversation. I was just wondering to continue on the last part. Because in my mind, it's partly the problem is partly what you mentioned earlier in your conversation, that you know these stories about Himmler because you've read them before. Because a lot of that history is written by Western Europeans. So maybe I was wondering what you think about it, because you gave part of the answer already yourself about the problem of the Westerners being so benign towards the faults of communism and absolutely clear about the faults of the Nazis. It's partly because it's a sort of a privilege. It's all about us. It's not about people far away who suffered, under different dictators. Also because we never read it and we never written it. And what you did, write about Lavrenti Beria, which is indeed, we do know about Himmler, but we don't know about Lavrenti Beria. Especially, some historians do, but you have to read Simon Sebag Montefiore or whatever before you understand what. So not so many, but no novelist. Never did. And that's what you did, and that's why I think it's you're part of the answer.
Okay, but may I ask you that? Because this is really issues that matters, and I'm really interested in. But okay, you don't know Beria, I can understand, but you know Stalin, right? Almost everybody heard that Stalin was a bad guy, right? And no?
Yeah. If you studied history and if you read Koba the Dread or something.
Come on, Stalin.
Yeah, I wonder where the Stalin Allee, not for a very long time, where the Stalin Allee here.
The next one. And just like word gulags.
Here in the hall, everyone knows, but if you would ask an average Dutch person, I'm not 100% sure. But we could do with the Balie and a vox pop, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right that the knowledge about Gulag camps is not so widespread as of the concentration camps, and it's just the case because when the translationing was in the making of this Gulag memoir that I mentioned, and I did some research myself to see what is available in Dutch and in English. You can't, if you're looking for something of a concentration camp from the Second World War, there's massive literature. There are like bookshelves on shelves on shelves and shelves. When you look to the Gulag literature, it's really limited. So there is a problem of knowledge. However, when it comes to names like Stalin, when it comes to people like what keeps on amazing me, I'm not talking about, I don't know, somebody on the street that maybe did not have education, but even philosophers like Sartre. He knew what was going on. He knew, he has visited Russia, and he just kept on defending the system. And that he did that is one thing, but that we never held him accountable. This is something that really annoys me, that a lot of left-wing intellectuals got away with defending the system, while there was enough information for those intellectuals to know, and that they kept on defending not only the systems, but even closed their eyes on millions of people that suffered in those camps.
Maybe another question. I see some hands. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you both for your insights, very valuable and very interesting. Talking about the topic of writing and literature, what is, in your opinions, the role or maybe also the power of literature in conflict or in geopolitical tensions?
Well, I think you wanted Nino to answer that. Yeah, well, very briefly, I'm working with, I'm a president of PEN Flanders, which is an association that is connected to PEN International. And PEN International is an organization worldwide that defends writers, it doesn't matter, novelists, journalists, essayists, poets, that are in a situation of war or censorship or authoritarian regimes. They are in jail or under house arrest. So they cannot write. And if you know their stories, it's so important that people are able to tell their stories. What is happening on the ground, what is happening with them, with their family, with the politics, how they see it. And it's not only information for us, but it's part of the picture of the truth that even journalists sometimes cannot reach. So I'm grateful for every writer who has the courage and takes the time to write their story and the life he or she has lived and the problems he or she has faced, so that, as you said, like, it's your life is a puzzle that you from different stories. And I think literature gives us also, every book, every novel is a part of this bigger picture of understanding the world. And I think I'm drawn to reading literature written by writers that write it through conflict or in conflict, because they really have a message and they tell the story to be heard. And I always feel almost responsible then that if they want to be heard, then I have to listen and read it. So writers have a huge role to play in times of war, to not only to shape the narrative, but to shed light on what has happened and on truth.
I was still thinking about the first question that was about how can it be that there are people still talking positive about communism, but not about Nazi Germany, for example. I think the big difference is that at the end of the Second World War, Germany had to commit that they were wrong, and there was big shame under German people about what they did during the Second World War. But that moment has never been after, I think, the collapse of the Soviet Union. You still have a Stalin museum, for example, in Gori, but still really positive about Stalin. So nobody ever said sorry, or there's not that sense of feeling. I think if you ask an average Russian, they don't have that same feeling as the Germans had about their Nazi past. And I think that's the big difference why we still see those things. How do you see that?
Yeah, some of people do and did, but say that and talk about that and mention that and tell their stories and share their stories. Even during the Soviet Union, even I knew that this word Gulag was something very, very terrible, and a lot of people didn't came back and so on. But obviously it was not enough. And of course, this narrative of being the winner of the war is also something that helped to create this myth of this great ideology of communism. But still, as I mentioned, I'm very much interested in that issue, and I'm often thinking about it, and I really don't get it, and I'm kind of obsessed by explaining people that this is very dangerous what they're talking about and what they're idealizing, and that they have no idea and they should have. And especially in Germany, I cannot really believe it because they had it. And I'm kind of shocked. And yes, that the East or Russia never did it, and that we still have this museum, it's one thing. But I'm talking about the West,
Exactly.
Western society. That we failed, and that in Russia they never buried that corpse. I mean, this is like a zombie. Soviet Union never ever stopped there. It just continued. It mutated. It kind of became a hybrid with capitalism, and it continued. But the other ideology is that it never happened in Russia. I'm not wondering about it. But here, I mean, we have like, okay, maybe it's not taught in school, and maybe, of course, I agree that even I knew more about Hitler than about Stalin, but that it's not okay, even like very simple, very, very simple, Stalin, bad guy. This is something that, and Gulag bad, and socialism no good. I think this kind of information should be after like so many years, but maybe I'm too naive and maybe I'm too hopeful, and maybe, yes, maybe it's important to continue and not to become speechless, and as I do often, but drink one more energy drink and continue.
Maybe a last question?
Hello, thank you for the talk. I would like to go away from history and ask again about the modern tendencies in Georgia. And I think you mentioned before this sort of ideological war, which in West is very easily could be understood, in my opinion, quite shallowly, like some sort of pro-Russian government and democracy. What in that case I would be interested in your opinion about how Russian state is actually involved with Georgian dream, and if it is, obviously we are waiting for the October election, and what are they waiting for then? Why not, if the Georgian dream is completely controlled by Russian state, what are they waiting for? Why don't they shut down the country? And what hope actually do we have then?
I'm not quite sure if I got your question. Why the Russians are not shutting down Georgia?
How much is Russian state, in your opinion, involved in Georgian dream?
A good question, I don't know. Nobody knows, because it's a very interesting thing why they came up with this law now. Because somehow it's not very logical, because they got much more problems, because I guess without without this law and without this uprising, they would have, I mean, they would have more chances to win. So it's not really logical. Of course, we don't have this kind of information. It's clear that he and his money comes from Russia. For me, it's logical, and it's also clear that Georgian dreams, they could never ever come into power by saying, yes, we're pro-Russian, because nobody would elected it, not even like the people who are more conservative or more this, no, we don't want war, or more like in between, because this is something that the whole country unites. We have a lot of topics that the country is divided and society is divided, but this is something that even like from 80 years old till 18, that most, of course you still have some, but it's a really real small percentage, that if you just go with a microphone on the street and ask people, that everybody would say, no, we don't want to go back to the Soviet Union. So that's why they knew that, and no, of course officially they don't represent Russia. Even now they're not saying, now they have like their posters for elections, and it's a farce, actually, but there is like, the slogan is only Europe, but with wealth, freedom, and something else. So it's, yeah, it's a very tricky. And of course, I don't know how much Russia is involved. Is there something, is there's like a, is something that really controlled by Kremlin, but it's clear that somehow the dangerous thing about Georgian Dream is that this party is completely united. There is no ideology, not at all. It's only money. And all the people who are surrounding these oligarchs, they are all kind of depending on him and somehow are obliged. So it means when he tomorrow becomes extremely leftish, people would say, yes, and they would start, I don't know, they would go for Woodstock. But the thing is that I often think, okay, what are his personal interests? Because it's all like, it's like his own playground. And in his case, he had some troubles with his money in Switzerland. And I think this offshore law is also because that it will be easier for his money. Because, okay, what does he's one of the richest men in the world. What does rich people do? They protect their money and they're interested in becoming even more rich. So, but I cannot answer the question because unfortunately nobody told me what's going on behind. But I can only assume and I can only kind of predict, and everything what comes to my mind is not really, kind of very positive. Every theory that I can develop in that case, yes.
Yeah. I think for now we're going to stop the conversation here, but please continue at the bar. I promised to ask a really small last question, but a former colleague of mine, she moved to Georgia and she's working as correspondent there. And she spoke with some young wine farmers and who discussed your book for evenings after each other. But they were really wondering if the greenhouse really existed, and if so, in which small village?
No, it doesn't.
Yeah. It's not based on a small village somewhere in Georgia. Because they thought, like, where should it be located if it would exist?
I had an inspiration on my mind, but it's always a mixture between some things that I know and some things that I invented. It's the same with the small city. People always ask me, what is the small city? What's the small city when it begins? And it doesn't exist because it's a mixture of some cities that I have on my mind, but it's not like a real place. So it's fictional.
Yeah. I will disappoint them, no. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. Thank you so much for all the insights you gave to speak more about your work. The books are for sale. If you go out, there are books, and Nino is also going to sign it, so please take your chance. Thank you for your attention, and give a very big applause for those two amazing authors.
Thank you.